30 feet below a federal office building in Lower Manhattan, construction workers in 1991 hit something that stopped every machine on site. Bones, human bones, hundreds of them, and then hundreds more. They had broken through the roof of the largest known burial ground for enslaved Africans in all of North America, a cemetery that the city of New York had paved over and forgotten for nearly 2 centuries. When scientists finally extracted DNA from those remains and ran it against every population database in existence, one result came back that no one in the field was prepared for. A single haplogroup appeared in the data that had no business being there at all. Not from West Africa, not from any region connected to the documented slave trade routes. Something far older. Something that forced geneticists to run the test 3 times just to believe it. And when the result held, it did not just change what we know about one cemetery. It changed everything we thought we understood about where Black Americans actually come from. Stay with me, because this story goes much further back than slavery, and it is not finished yet. The site sits in Lower Manhattan, in what was once called the New Amsterdam Colony, later to become New York City. For most of American history, people thought of slavery as a southern institution, plantations, cotton, the Deep South. New York City, in the minds of most Americans, was something different, a place of immigrants and industry and eventual abolition. What the burial ground proved when those bones started coming out of the ground in 1991 was that slavery had been foundational to New York from the very beginning. The unearthing of the site challenged the narrow popular perception of slavery as an antebellum, southern-based agrarian institution. It revealed to the public what historians had long recognized, that slavery could be found throughout America, in every period of its history before 1865. The burial ground had been in use from roughly the 1640s to 1794, when the expanding city paved over it and built on top. For nearly 200 years, it sat underneath streets and buildings, unknown, undisturbed, sealed under layers of urban construction. It was the final resting place of some 15,000 enslaved African captives brought to New York in the 17th and 18th centuries to build the city and provide the labor for its thriving economy. When construction workers broke through in July 1991, the initial government response was not to stop and study what they had found. The response was to continue. The Federal General Services Administration, which was overseeing the construction of a new office building at 290 Broadway, was aware that burials might be present at the site. They had received preliminary warnings. And they moved forward anyway, scheduling excavations to happen simultaneously with active construction, which is against every standard archaeological protocol that exists. It is highly unusual for an archaeological excavation to take place while construction is in progress. By 1992, 390 burials had already been removed, and the GSA was preparing to remove 200 more. The backhoe was running. The bones were being excavated in conditions that destroyed context, mixed remains, and erased information that could never be recovered. And the Black community of New York watched it happen and said no. The African-American public held protests and prayer vigils over the following 2 years in order to stop the federal building project that nearly destroyed the site. They did not just petition. They showed up. They demonstrated. They held congressional hearings. Congressman and chairman of the House of Representatives on Buildings and Grounds, Augustus Savage, informed the GSA that funding would be stopped until the matters concerning the burial ground were renegotiated. Construction soon stopped. President George H. Bush signed legislation prohibiting the planned pavilion construction and approved $3 million for a memorial. In 1993, the burial ground was listed on the National Register of Historic Places. It was later designated a national monument in 2006. But the community won something even more important than the landmark designation. They won control of the science. The 419 skeletal remains that had already been excavated were being held at Lehman College, where the initial analysis had been conducted by a team the community considered unqualified and disrespectful of the spiritual significance of what they were working with. Community activists and political leaders insisted on congressional hearings regarding the matter. With the concurrence of the local community, the General Services Administration transferred the remains to Howard University. Howard University, a historically Black institution. The community had fought for the right to determine who would speak for their ancestors, and they won. In November 1993, Howard University hosted a ceremony to honor the ancestors of the African burial ground. There was a procession to Howard's chapel, and an elder from the New York descendant community handed Michael Blakey, the scientific director of the project, a box carefully wrapped in an African cloth. Blakey later said it was powerful, that they wanted to commemorate what these remains meant to their communities, the complementarity of science and spirituality of Africa and the diaspora. This was not outsiders studying a community's history. This was a historically Black institution leading the scientific recovery of Black history. Every decision about how to analyze these remains, what questions to ask, how to treat the ancestors, was made by people who understood what was at stake not just academically but personally. And then the DNA work began. The question the science asked was one that had haunted Black American families for generations. Not just where did we come from broadly, but where exactly did these specific people come from? The machinery of the slave trade had been specifically designed to erase that answer. Names were taken at the point of capture. Languages were forbidden on the ships and on the plantations. Connections to specific homelands were severed generation after generation until the knowledge was simply gone. A Black American in the 20th century trying to trace their family history hit a wall, and on the other side of that wall was a continent, but which part of it was impossible to know. The Transatlantic Slave Trade Database, the most comprehensive historical record of the trade that exists, documents approximately 12.5 million Africans forcibly transported to the Americas between 1501 and 1867. According to these historical records, 5.7% embarked from Senegambia, 3.2% from Sierra Leone, 2.7% from the Windward Coast, 9.6% from the Gold Coast, 16.1% from the Bight of Benin, 12.3% from the Bight of Biafra, 46.3% from West Central Africa, and 4.1% from Southeast Africa. The expectation going into the DNA analysis was that the remains would reflect those numbers. West African ancestry, predominantly. Some Central African signal. The genetics matching the history, confirming what the ship's records showed. For most of the individuals analyzed, that is exactly what happened. West African maternal lineages came back clearly and consistently. The genetics matched the historical record. The scientists nodded. And then something appeared in the data that stopped everything. A single maternal lineage came back unlike any of the others. Not West African, not Central African. It was L0. To understand why that result made researchers stop and run the test again, you need to understand what L0 actually is. Haplogroup L0 represents some of humanity's most ancient maternal lineages. It reaches its highest frequencies among the Khoisan peoples of southern Africa. The Khoisan are the click-speaking forager peoples of Namibia and Botswana, one of the oldest continuously existing human populations on Earth. The oldest extant human maternal lineages include mitochondrial haplogroups L0D and L0K, found in the southern African click-speaking forager peoples broadly classified as Khoisan. Research has confirmed L0D as the earliest diverged lineage, estimated at approximately 172,000 years old. 172,000 years old, not a typo. This is a maternal lineage that traces back to the very earliest anatomically modern humans in Africa. It sits at the absolute root of the human family tree. When population geneticists draw the tree of all human maternal lineages, L0 is where it begins. It predates the migrations out of Africa. It predates the founding of every other human lineage on the planet. Finding it is like finding the original edition of a book that every other book was copied from. And it was in colonial Manhattan, in a person who had been enslaved, who had been brought across the Atlantic, and whose bones had been sealed under a federal building since the 1700s. Fatima Jackson, a biologist and anthropologist at Howard University, who worked as director of genetics for the African Burial Ground Project, said that they were finding that the maternal lineages of African Americans come from all over Africa. From East Africa, from West Africa, from Central Africa, the majority for sure from West and Central Africa, but also from Southern Africa, and from Eastern Africa, and from North Africa. The researchers ran every available test to rule out contamination. They checked the sampling methodology. They sent the result to independent colleagues for verification. The result held. The L0 signal was real, and its geographic associations in Africa pointed to Southern and East African populations that the documented slave trade routes placed nowhere near the Atlantic coast. The ports the ships departed from were on the West and Central African coast. The people carrying L0 at the highest frequencies lived thousands of kilometers away in the interior and the south of the continent. So how does that lineage end up in a grave in Manhattan? Here's where the science becomes genuinely important, because there are really only a few possible explanations, and none of them are simple. The first explanation involves what historians have long documented, but what rarely makes it into the popular understanding of the slave trade. The records that survive document the ports of embarkation, not the origins of the people who passed through them. A person recorded as departing from a West African port may have been brought to that port from hundreds or even thousands of kilometers away. Africa had extensive internal trade networks long before European involvement, ancient routes connecting the interior of the continent to its coasts, along which goods, livestock, and enslaved people moved continuously. The genetic signal may be recording a history that predates the Atlantic ships entirely, a history of movement across the African continent that left no written record but left a molecular one. The second explanation is more disorienting. Historians have documented the existence of the Indian Ocean slave trade, a separate and older system that moved people from East and Southern Africa toward the Middle East and South Asia. There is evidence that this system intersected with the Atlantic system in ways that surviving documents do not record. People who entered one trade network may have ended up through routes that history never captured in a completely different one. The L0 signal may be recording a journey that crossed not one ocean but two. Fatima Jackson had a revelation during the analysis. The scale of diversity was far beyond what the official record suggested. The people buried in that Manhattan cemetery were not simply representatives of the coastal West African societies that European traders had documented and mapped. They were the products of thousands of years of movement, mixture, and connection across a continent that is, by every genetic measure, the most diverse place on Earth. The data revealed genomic diversity among African and African American populations far more complex than originally thought, reflecting deep historical, cultural, and linguistic impacts on gene flow among populations. A study by Sarah Tishkoff at the University of Pennsylvania and her colleagues found that among African Americans tested, individuals had as little as 1% West African ancestry and as much as 99%. The range is not a rounding error. It is a reflection of just how varied and complex the actual origins of the people brought across the Atlantic truly were. The L0 haplogroup was not the only signal to emerge from expanded analysis. In a study of the Gullah Geechee peoples of the coastal sea islands in South Carolina and Georgia Lowcountry, all had mitochondrial lineages belonging to African haplogroups, with individuals carrying lineages spanning the full African maternal spectrum. The Gullah Geechee are among the most culturally distinct Black American communities, known for preserving African cultural practices, languages, and traditions that were severed elsewhere. What the DNA showed is that their genetic origins are as diverse as their cultural legacy. And there is a dimension to all of this that the science is only now catching up to. Family stories passed down through generations, preserved in the way oral history preserves what written records cannot, describe connections to places that did not match the official account. Grandmothers who spoke of origins that did not fit the geography of the documented slave trade. Communities with cultural practices that researchers struggled to connect to the West African societies named in the historical record. Physical features that diverged in ways anthropologists noted without explanation decades before DNA analysis caught up. The science did not discover something the communities did not know. In many cases, it gave researchers a language to hear what was already being said. Oral traditions carrying memories of origins that the historical record could not confirm or explain, now finding their reflection in the genetic code. One of the recurring failures of historical scholarship applied to the African diaspora has been the assumption that what was documented is what happened, that the absence of written records is the same as the absence of history. The African burial ground DNA proved that assumption wrong in a way that cannot be argued with. The bones were there. The DNA was there. The signal was unmistakable. And no ship manifest, and no plantation ledger, and no colonial law had been able to erase it. Think about what that means for a moment. Slavery was a system that tried very specifically to destroy identity. It took names. It took languages. It took the knowledge of homeland. It used law and violence and generations of enforced forgetting to sever people from the specific human histories they came from. And it failed. Not completely, not everywhere, but in the most fundamental way possible, it failed. Not because you cannot change the DNA. You can forbid a person from speaking their language. You can rename them. You can separate them from everyone who shares their origin. But you cannot reach inside the mitochondria of their cells and change the lineage that has been passing from mother to child for 170,000 years. That information survived, sealed in bone, buried under a building, waiting. The current best understanding of Black American ancestry, still being refined, still generating new data and new debate, looks something like this. Black Americans descend primarily from people taken from West and Central Africa through the transatlantic slave trade. According to historical records, the majority embarked from West Central Africa and the Bight of Benin and Bight of Biafra regions. That part of the story is documented and real. But layered beneath and alongside that primary signal is a genetic complexity that reflects thousands of years of African history before the slave trade began. Movement across the continent, ancient trade networks, population histories that no single port of embarkation could ever fully represent. And lineages so ancient they trace back to the very beginning of what it means to be human. The African burial ground now sits at 290 Broadway in Lower Manhattan as a national monument. The 419 skeletal remains, after years of scientific study at Howard University, were reinterred in October 2003 with ceremony and with the community present. It was not a quiet administrative act. It was a full ceremony, a procession, prayers. Community members who had spent years fighting to protect their ancestors were there to witness them return to the earth properly, with dignity, as people, not as data points. The bones are back in the ground, but what they told us cannot be unlearned. The maternal lineages of the people buried in that cemetery came from all over Africa. The coastal West African origins that history documented were real and present, but they were not the whole story. The whole story includes an ancient lineage that traces back to the very root of humanity, carried in the body of a person who was enslaved, who was transported across an ocean, who was worked and died and buried in a place that forgot them for 200 years, and whose genetic code survived everything. The L0 haplogroup that appeared in that data is approximately 172,000 years old. The machinery of slavery lasted about 350 years. The DNA survived it the way it has survived everything that has ever tried to erase it, quietly, inside the bone, passing from one generation to the next, in a chain so ancient that the origin of the slave trade is a recent interruption in a story that goes back to the beginning of human existence. The origin story of Black Americans is not wrong, it is incomplete. And the parts that are missing are not small footnotes. They are entire chapters that no ship captain ever wrote down, that no plantation owner ever recorded, that no law could reach. They survived in exactly the one place that nothing and no one could access. The genetic code itself, sealed in bone, recovered at last. Not because an outsider came to study a community from the outside, but because a historically Black university insisted on leading the research into its own community's ancestors. And a community stopped a bulldozer with their own hands and demanded that their ancestors be treated as people. That is the story the DNA tells, not just where the people came from, but how the people fought to ensure that their origins would finally be known.